Jesus said, "Have you understood all this?" They answered, "Yes." I'm wondering if we can answer the same way. Can you answer yes? The parables are both confusing and comforting. They're comforting because they're familiar to us. We know them, or at least we think we know them. We may not be able to explain them in great detail, necessarily what they mean, but we know what Jesus tells us. Ultimately, we know they mean something good, the coming of God's kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. But they are confusing because we don't know exactly how they foretell the coming kingdom. We try to put ourselves into the stories somehow in order for it to make sense. Is Jesus talking about us in these parables? Is he talking about the church? The answer in both cases is emphatically no. Jesus is talking about the kingdom of heaven. It is God's work, not ours, not the church's, but God's work that comes to light to tell us how to live, how to strive for God's glory. Now, certainly Matthew wants the church or the assembly to hear it, but he writes of Jesus talking about the kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is like something. Or the kingdom of heaven can be compared to something. He's not saying we are like those things or the church is like those things, but the kingdom. And the parables are a bit outrageous. They give us exaggerated pictures that don't quite make reasonable or rational sense to us. But that's the beauty of God's kingdom. It doesn't always make sense to us, but it is exactly what God intends. These parables would have been shocking to the people in Matthew's time, and they should be shocking to us today, but they aren't, really. Because, again, we think we know the stories. They're familiar to us, and we think we understand what they mean, and certainly, at some level, we do. But before we get into today's parables, I think it is important to point out how they fit into the bigger picture in Matthew's gospel. All of the parables come in this chapter 13, but over the past few weeks we have jumped around a bit and not heard them in the order they appear in the gospel. And this is most likely because it would be too much to hear all of them at one hearing, and likely the sermon would be too long and try to do too much with all of them put together. So they are broken up over a few weeks. Hopefully my sermons are more tolerable this way. First, we have Jesus get into the boat to address the crowds. He tells the parable of the sower, how the seed grows depending on where it lands. The disciples come to Jesus, and before they ask him to explain the parable, they ask why he speaks to the crowds in parables. We didn't hear this part 2 weeks ago. Jesus says, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. The reason I speak to them in parables is that seeing they do not perceive, and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand." He then quotes a prophecy from Isaiah saying how the hearts of the people has grown dull, but there is hope that they will turn and be healed. Jesus speaks in parables so that the crowds, hungry for that word, hungry for a shepherd to lead them, that crowd who do not at first understand might reflect on his words and turn to God and be healed. He then explains the parable of the sower to the disciples. Returning his attention to the crowd, Jesus goes on to tell 3 parables using the words, "The kingdom of heaven can be compared to," or "the kingdom of heaven is like." He tells of the weeds and the wheat, what we heard last week, then the mustard seed, and then the yeast, which we both heard today. Then he leaves the crowd and he goes back into the house. The disciples follow him and ask him to explain the parable of the weeds and the wheat. I guess they were good with the mustard seed and the yeast. Jesus explains about the weeds and the wheat, and then he goes on to tell 3 more parables just to the disciples. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, like a pearl of great value, and like a dragnet full of fish. Then he asks them if they have understood all this, and they said, yes. I kind of wish they had said no, so we could hear Jesus give more explanations. But this time we're left on our own. What we didn't hear today is the next verse that ends this section and says Jesus finished the parables and left that place. So a little out of order, but our first two parables today are told to the whole crowd, and the last three just to the disciples. So we begin today with the mustard seed, a story I'm sure we're all very familiar with. We most likely grew up hearing it and learning about it in Sunday school. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, the smallest of seeds that then grows into the largest of shrubs. Then Matthew puts a bit of a twist on it, because he has Jesus say that it then goes from the largest of shrubs to become a tree, where birds will gather and make nests in its branches. Now, I'm not a master gardener, but I don't know of any shrub that can then grow into a tree. But that's the kingdom. That's why this is a parable. It tells of something you don't expect, how what was small and seemingly insignificant becomes something big that you can't miss. Would that we saw the kingdom as easily as a tree standing right in front of us. Then the story of the yeast. In Jewish tradition, yeast would have been something thought of as bad, something that corrupts. But here it is compared to the kingdom of heaven and leavens the whole 3 measures of flour. On the surface, this might not sound out of the ordinary, not like the mustard seed anyway, but we have to understand how much 3 measures of flour actually is. I hear it and I think of what I might do when baking bread, and I think, well, that's maybe like 3 cups of flour. To this I would add a small package of yeast and it would rise and I'd make a couple of loaves of bread. But 3 measures is a huge amount, enough to bake bread for about 150 people. So the thought of using just a small amount of yeast is what makes this so amazing. The kingdom is like the small bit of yeast that leavens an enormous amount of flour. Just a little can go a long way. Again, something you wouldn't expect, but God's kingdom comes. We can't have these preconceived notions of what we think the kingdom will be, because Jesus says it is not what we expect, but what God intends. And right when we think we've got it all figured out, God surprises us and changes the rules. We can plant the seed, we can add the yeast, but then we've got to get out of the way and let God take over. One of the biggest surprises of all in the kingdom is Jesus himself, someone who comes not as a warrior king, but as a humble shepherd who gives himself for our sake. That is the kingdom of heaven. Not the perfect picture or scenario of what we think it should be, but it is in the least of these, the smallest that becomes large, and the weakest that becomes strong. There is the kingdom. The kingdom was certainly hard to see for Jacob, who tries to do right and gets tricked over and over again. But God is with him. God remains faithful, and Jacob still thrives. Laban cannot stop God from doing what God wills, even if Jacob does not understand the way in which all of this happens. Jacob and Laban agree on wages, that Jacob will work 7 years for Laban in order to marry Rachel. But Laban tricks him and gives his older daughter Leah to Jacob instead of Rachel. Eventually, as we heard today, Jacob does marry Rachel, as well as both wives' maids. And to him is born 12 sons, along with some daughters. And those sons that will become, along with Joseph's sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob is frustrated, though. He's frustrated through all this with Laban's deceptions, but carries on knowing God is with him. knowing he will indeed see the kingdom. But back to the parables. What unexpected thing is Jesus telling the disciples with the other 3 parables we heard today? The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. And wouldn't you do the same? If you found the kingdom of heaven, wouldn't you do all that you could to hold on to it forever? This represents those people who in wholehearted dedication put everything else aside to focus on Jesus' message and what it yields. Everything for the kingdom. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. This represents those people who can see great value in other things, but value the kingdom more. Again, everything set aside for the kingdom. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. Here, much like the wheat and the weeds, the angels come and separate the good from the bad at the end of the age. Have you understood all this? The disciples say they have. And Jesus adds that every scribe, that is, an expert in Mosaic law, who has become one of his disciples, that is, someone trained for the kingdom, will be able to preserve past insights and expand on them, bring out the old and the new. Take what they've learned and make it bigger. Take the unexpected and bring in the kingdom. If they know the law of Moses, they know it pointed the way to the coming of the kingdom through the Messiah, through Jesus. The kingdom is here, right in front of us. All we have to do is see it and accept it. But it's hard sometimes. It is hard when things get in the way, things both in our control, like how we treat others, and out of our control, like an airborne virus spread across the world. But every step we take to make the world a better place brings with it the kingdom. Every time we work for a cure to this pandemic, we bring the kingdom closer. Every time we do our part to stop the spread of the virus, we bring the kingdom closer. Every time we overcome racial injustices and work for true equality, we bring the kingdom closer. What we do and how we go about it bring the kingdom closer. The kingdom of heaven is like, to what can we compare it? If we know Jesus and follow what Jesus teaches us, to love our neighbors as ourselves, to reach out to those in need, to respect the dignity of every human being, the unexpected happens. What seemed impossible becomes possible. Things that were cast down are being raised up, and things which had grown old are being made new. And the kingdom comes. Have we understood all this? I believe we are beginning to.